The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as thousands of tourists gathered for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood 7-year-old Emma Thompson, her small hand tightly gripping her grandmother's weathered fingers. The little girl's eyes sparkled with excitement behind thick glasses that seemed too large for her delicate face. Emma had been dreaming of this moment for months. After being diagnosed with a rare blood disorder that required frequent hospital visits, her grandmother Margaret had promised her a special trip to London to see the famous guards she had read about in storybooks. The red uniforms, the tall, black hats, and the precise marching had captured her imagination during countless hours in hospital beds. "Gran, when will they come out?" Emma whispered, bouncing slightly on her toes, despite the weakness that often plagued her small body. Her pale complexion stood out among the crowd of healthy, sun-kissed tourists surrounding them. Margaret smiled down at her granddaughter, adjusting the bright yellow scarf around Emma's neck. "Soon, my dear. They should begin any minute now." The crowd pressed closer to the palace gates, cameras ready, voices chattering in dozens of languages. Emma found herself pushed further back, her view blocked by the sea of adults towering above her. She stretched onto her tiptoes, but even then she could barely see over the shoulders and backpacks of the tourists in front of her. Inside the palace, Sergeant James Mitchell was completing his final preparations. At 28 years old, he had served as a Queen's Guard for 6 years, standing motionless for hours in all weather conditions. His colleagues often joked that he had nerves of steel and the discipline of a machine. James took pride in his unwavering composure and strict adherence to protocol, but today felt different somehow. As he adjusted his scarlet tunic and checked that every brass button gleamed perfectly, James felt an unusual restlessness. Perhaps it was the letter he had received from his sister the night before, telling him about her daughter's first day at school, or maybe it was the dream he had about his late father, who had also served in the military. The ceremony began with the familiar sound of drums echoing across the courtyard. The tourists fell silent, their cameras clicking as the guards emerged in perfect formation. Emma strained to see, but her view remained blocked. Tears of disappointment began to well up in her eyes. "I can't see anything, Gran," she whispered, her voice trembling. Margaret looked around desperately, trying to find a gap in the crowd or perhaps convince someone to let the little girl stand in front of them. But the tourists were packed so tightly that movement seemed impossible. As the guards marched in their precise formation, James caught a glimpse of something that made him pause internally, though his expression remained stoic. Through a small gap between tourists, he spotted a tiny girl in a yellow scarf, standing far behind the crowd. Her grandmother was lifting her up, trying to give her a better view, but the elderly woman's strength was clearly limited. James had seen thousands of tourists over the years. Most were there for photos and bragging rights, snapping pictures without truly appreciating the history and tradition they were witnessing. But something about this little girl was different. Even from a distance, he could see the genuine wonder in her eyes, the way she pressed against the crowd barrier, not with casual curiosity, but with the desperate hope of someone for whom this moment meant everything. The march continued flawlessly, each step perfectly timed, each movement a testament to months of rigorous training. The crowd watched in awe as the guards demonstrated the precision and discipline that had made them legendary around the world. But James found his attention divided between his duties and the small figure in yellow who had somehow captured his notice. As they approached the section of the crowd where Emma stood, James could see her more clearly. She was obviously unwell, her skin pale and drawn, but her eyes burned with an intensity that spoke of dreams and determination. Her grandmother had managed to lift her again, and Emma's face pressed against the iron railings, her small hands gripping the metal bars as if holding on to hope itself. The protocol was clear and absolute. Queen's Guards were not to interact with tourists during ceremonies. They were living symbols of British tradition, maintaining an aura of mystique and authority that had been cultivated for centuries. Any deviation from procedure would result in serious disciplinary action and could potentially end a military career. James had never broken protocol. Not once in 6 years had he stepped out of line, spoken during duty, or acknowledged the crowd beyond his required ceremonial actions. His record was spotless, his reputation impeccable. Fellow guards respected him for his discipline, and his superiors had noted his potential for advancement. But as he marched past Emma, something inside him shifted. He saw her grandmother struggling to hold her up, saw the way the little girl's energy was fading even as she fought to maintain her view of the ceremony. In that moment, James was transported back to his own childhood, remembering how his father would lift him onto his shoulders so he could see over crowds at military parades. The formation continued its march, but James's mind was racing. He thought about why he had joined the military in the first place. It wasn't just for the honor and tradition, though those meant a great deal to him. It was because he wanted to serve others, to be part of something greater than himself, to make a positive difference in the world. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, James found himself at a crossroads between duty and conscience, between protocol and humanity. The little girl in the yellow scarf had unknowingly presented him with a choice that would define not just his career, but his character. The crowd began to shift restlessly as the formal portion of the ceremony ended. Soon the tourists would disperse. Emma would go home with only partial memories of blocked views and disappointment, and James would return to his post, having maintained perfect military discipline. But sometimes, perfect discipline and perfect humanity point in different directions. And sometimes a single moment of unexpected kindness can change not just one life, but the lives of everyone who witnesses it. The ceremony concluded with the traditional fanfare, and the guards began their final march back toward the palace gates. Emma's shoulders sagged with disappointment as she realized the magnificent display was ending, and she had barely seen any of it. The adult tourists around her started gathering their belongings and checking their photos, chatting excitedly about the experience they had just witnessed. "Did you see it, Gran?" Emma asked quietly, though her voice carried the weight of her disappointment. Margaret's heart ached for her granddaughter. She had saved for months to make this trip possible, knowing that Emma's condition made travel increasingly difficult. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic about her treatment, but they had also hinted that making happy memories now was important. "I saw the beautiful red uniforms, dear," Margaret said, kneeling down to Emma's level. "And those magnificent black hats just like in your picture books." Emma nodded bravely, but tears started flowing down her cheeks. "I wanted to see them march, Gran. I wanted to see them do their special walk." Meanwhile, James had completed his march and should have been heading directly to his post. The other guards were filing into their designated positions, their faces maintaining the stone-like expressions that tourists expected. But James stopped. In a decision that surprised even himself, he broke from formation. His fellow guards noticed immediately. Sergeant Williams, marching beside him, caught his eye with a questioning look. Protocol dictated that any deviation from procedure be reported immediately. Breaking formation during a ceremony was a serious offense that could result in immediate suspension. But James had made his choice. He turned and walked directly toward the section of the barrier where Emma stood with her grandmother. The crowd, which had been dispersing, suddenly stopped and stared. Whispers rippled through the gathering as people realized something unprecedented was happening. "Look, Gran." Emma's voice was barely a whisper as she saw the tall guard in his magnificent red uniform walking straight toward them. "Is he coming over here?" Margaret couldn't believe what she was seeing. In all her 73 years, she had never witnessed a Queen's Guard break protocol. She had heard they were trained to ignore everything around them, to remain as immovable as the palace walls themselves. James approached the barrier where Emma stood. The crowd had gone completely silent now, hundreds of people holding their breath to see what would happen next. Cameras were raised, but somehow the moment felt too sacred for the usual tourist photography. Standing directly in front of Emma, James did something that sent shockwaves through the crowd of onlookers. He smiled, not the practiced, distant smile of a performer, but a warm, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Then, in a move that defied centuries of protocol, he spoke. "Hello there, little miss." His voice was gentle but carried clearly in the sudden silence. "I noticed you couldn't see the ceremony very well from back there." Emma's eyes widened behind her thick glasses. She looked up at the towering guard, with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You're talking to me," she whispered. "I am indeed," James replied, his smile growing wider. "Would you like to come closer and see what a real Queen's Guard looks like?" The crowd pressed in, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched her granddaughter's face light up with pure joy. "Is that allowed?" Margaret asked quietly, her voice shaking with emotion. James looked at the elderly woman and saw the love and concern in her eyes. He could tell immediately that this wasn't just any tourist seeking a photo opportunity. This was a grandmother who had moved heaven and earth to make her granddaughter's dream come true. "Sometimes," James said, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised even himself, "the most important rules are the ones written in our hearts." He gestured to Emma. "Would you like to come through the barrier? I think there's something special. You should see." Emma looked up at her grandmother with questioning eyes. Margaret nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. She helped Emma climb carefully through a gap in the barrier, her hands shaking slightly from both age and emotion. Once Emma was on the other side, standing just a few feet from James, the difference in their sizes was almost comical. The little girl barely reached his waist, and his tall black bearskin hat seemed to tower impossibly high above her. "Would you like to know a secret about being a Queen's Guard?" James asked. Crouching down so he was closer to Emma's eye level, Emma nodded eagerly, her previous disappointment completely forgotten. "The most important part of our job isn't standing perfectly still or marching in straight lines," James said quietly, his voice meant for Emma, but somehow carrying to the captivated crowd around them. "The most important part is remembering that we serve the people, all the people, especially brave little ones who travel far just to see us." Emma giggled, a sound so pure and joyful that several people in the crowd found themselves wiping away tears. "Are you really allowed to talk?" Emma asked, her curiosity overcoming her shyness. "Well," James said with a conspiratorial whisper, "I might get in a little trouble for this, but sometimes doing the right thing is more important than following every rule exactly." He stood back up to his full height and assumed a perfect military posture. "Would you like to see the proper Queen's Guard stance?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. James demonstrated the rigid posture, explaining how they trained to stand perfectly still for hours. He showed her how they held their rifles, and how they managed to keep their expressions neutral even when tourists tried to make them laugh. "But the hardest part," he said, breaking his stance again and smiling down at her, "is not smiling when we see someone as special as you." The crowd around them had grown larger, with people stopping their departure to witness this unprecedented interaction. Word was spreading quickly through the tourist groups, and more visitors were hurrying over to see what was happening. Emma's energy seemed to be returning as her excitement grew. The pale, tired little girl who had struggled to see over the crowd was now glowing with happiness, her eyes bright and alert. "Would you like to meet my hat?" James asked playfully. Emma's confusion was adorable. "Meet your hat?" "This," James said, carefully removing his towering bearskin hat, "is probably the most famous hat in all of England. It weighs almost as much as you do." He held the hat out so Emma could see it up close. Her eyes went wide with wonder as she reached out tentatively to touch the soft fur. Emma's small fingers traced the soft fur of the bearskin hat, with the reverence usually reserved for touching something sacred. Her eyes were wide with wonder as she realized she was actually touching a piece of history that had been part of British tradition for hundreds of years. "It's so soft," she whispered in amazement. "And so tall. How do you see with it on?" James chuckled, a sound that seemed to surprise both himself and the watching crowd. "It takes practice. When I first started training, I walked into more doorways than I care to admit." The crowd around them had grown significantly. What had started as a few dozen lingering tourists had become a gathering of several hundred people. Word was spreading through social media faster than wildfire. Videos and photos of the unprecedented interaction were already being shared across platforms, with captions like, "You won't believe what this royal guard just did," And this will restore your faith in humanity." Margaret watched from just outside the barrier, her hands pressed to her heart. In all the months of hospital visits, treatments, and watching her granddaughter struggle with her illness, she had never seen Emma look so alive, so purely joyful. The transformation was remarkable and heartbreaking all at once. "Would you like to try wearing it?" James asked Emma, though he immediately had second thoughts. The hat was incredibly heavy and valuable, and letting a civilian wear it was probably another dozen violations of protocol. But Emma's gasp of delight made any concerns about regulations seem trivial. "Could I really?" she asked, her voice filled with such hope that James knew he couldn't possibly say no. "Well," he said, glancing around at his fellow guards who were watching from their positions with expressions ranging from shock to admiration, "I think we can make an exception for someone as special as you." Very carefully, James placed the enormous hat on Emma's small head. It was comically oversized, covering most of her face and shoulders, but her delighted giggle from somewhere inside the massive headpiece sent ripples of laughter through the crowd. "I can't see anything." Emma's muffled voice came from within the hat, which only made everyone laugh harder. "That's exactly how we feel sometimes," James said, carefully adjusting the hat so Emma could peek out from under the rim. "But the important thing is that everyone can see you looking absolutely magnificent." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Cameras clicked and phones recorded as Emma stood there, dwarfed by the enormous hat but beaming with pride. She tried to stand as straight and tall as James had demonstrated, her small body attempting to mirror his military posture. "Am I doing it right?" she asked, trying to look serious but unable to contain her smile. "Perfectly," James assured her. "You look every bit as official as any guard in the Queen's service." From her position outside the barrier, Margaret was sobbing openly now. Several other tourists had noticed her emotional response and had gathered around her, offering tissues and kind words. When they learned that Emma was her granddaughter and about the little girl's medical condition, the entire section of the crowd became invested in the moment, cheering Emma on as if she were their own family member. "She's been through so much," Margaret managed to explain to a kind woman from Australia who had offered her a tissue. "The doctors, the treatments, the uncertainty. This trip was supposed to be something special for her, but I never imagined anything like this." The Australian woman, whose own eyes were now wet with tears, nodded understandingly. "That guard is giving her something no amount of money could buy. He's giving her magic." Meanwhile, James was becoming aware that his unprecedented break from protocol had created a situation far beyond what he had initially intended. He could see his commanding officers gathering in the distance, their expressions unreadable, but certainly serious. He knew that consequences were inevitable, but looking down at Emma's joy-filled face, he found he didn't care. "You know," James said to Emma, "being a Queen's Guard is about more than just wearing the uniform and following orders. It's about serving with honor and protecting what's important." Emma looked up at him with serious eyes, still barely visible, under the enormous hat. "What's the most important thing to protect?" The question was so earnest, so genuinely curious that James felt his heart clench. He thought about all his training, all the lectures about duty and protocol, all the emphasis on maintaining tradition and order. "Hope," he said finally, the word coming from somewhere deep inside him that he hadn't accessed in years. "The most important thing we protect is hope. Hope that the world can be beautiful, that people can be kind, that dreams can come true." Emma nodded solemnly, as if she understood something profound in his words. "I hoped I would see the guards today, and I hoped they would be as wonderful as Gran said they were. And you're even more wonderful than I hoped." The simple honesty of her words hit James harder than any commendation or criticism he had ever received. He realized that in breaking protocol to make one little girl's dream come true, he had somehow found his way back to the real reason he had become a soldier in the first place. "Would you like to learn the official Queen's Guard salute?" James asked, deciding that if he was already in trouble, he might as well make this moment as special as possible for Emma. "Yes, please," Emma said, her excitement causing the hat to wobble dangerously on her small head. James carefully steadied the hat and then demonstrated the precise military salute that Queen's Guards used during ceremonies. Emma watched intently, her face serious, with concentration as she tried to memorize every detail. "Now you try," James encouraged. Emma raised her small hand and attempted to copy the salute. Her form was imperfect, her tiny hand barely resembling the sharp precision of a trained soldier, but her effort was absolute. "Outstanding," James declared. "That's the best salute I've seen all day." The crowd erupted in another round of applause. Several people were openly crying now, and the atmosphere had transformed from typical tourist excitement into something much more meaningful. Strangers were hugging each other, sharing tissues, and talking about how this moment had affected them. A little boy near the front of the crowd called out, "Can I try the hat too?" James looked at the boy, then at Emma, then at the growing crowd of children who had somehow made their way to the front. He was already so far beyond protocol that there was no point in stopping now. "Well," he said with a grin that would have shocked his commanding officers, "I think we might need to have an impromptu lesson about what it means to be a Queen's Guard." What happened next would be talked about for years to come. James looked at the sea of eager young faces pressed against the barrier and made a decision that would fundamentally change how people thought about the stoic, untouchable Queen's Guards. "All right, then," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent courtyard. "Who here would like to learn what it really means to serve the Queen?" A chorus of excited voices responded immediately. Children's hands shot up into the air. Parents lifted smaller children higher so they could see, and even adults found themselves raising their hands, caught up in the magic of the moment. Emma, still wearing the enormous bearskin hat, giggled, with delight at the chaos she had helped create. "Are you going to teach everyone?" she asked James. "I think that's exactly what's going to happen," James replied, though he was beginning to realize the magnitude of what he had started. His commanding officers were now openly moving toward the scene, but James noticed that they had stopped their approach and seemed to be simply observing, perhaps as curious as everyone else about what would unfold. James helped Emma carefully, remove the heavy hat, and then addressed the crowd with the kind of authority that only comes from years of military training. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls," he called out, his voice carrying the command presence that had been drilled into him during countless hours of training. "Today you're going to learn that being a Queen's Guard isn't about standing perfectly, still or never smiling. It's about service, honor, and protecting what matters most." The crowd had grown to nearly 1,000 people now. Tourists who had been heading to other attractions had turned back when they heard about the unprecedented event taking place at Buckingham Palace. Local Londoners, alerted by social media posts, were hurrying to witness something that had never happened before in the long history of the Queen's Guard. "First lesson," James continued, falling naturally into the role of instructor. "A Queen's Guard stands at attention not because we're statues, but because we're always ready to serve. Can everyone show me your best attention stance?" The sight that followed was both hilarious and heartwarming. Hundreds of people, from toddlers to grandparents, attempted to stand at military attention. Some were surprisingly good, others were comically off target, but everyone was trying their best with infectious enthusiasm. Emma, standing beside James, tried to help demonstrate the proper posture. Despite her small size and physical limitations, she stood as straight and proud as she could manage, becoming an inspiration to everyone watching. "Excellent," James declared, surveying the crowd's efforts. "Now, second lesson. A Queen's Guard salute isn't just a gesture, it's a sign of respect for everyone we serve. That includes all of you." He demonstrated the salute again, and this time hundreds of hands rose in an approximation of the military gesture. The precision varied wildly, but the spirit was uniform and powerful. Margaret, watching from the sidelines, found herself saluting along with everyone else, tears streaming down her face. Several news crews had arrived and were filming everything, but somehow the media presence didn't cheapen the moment. If anything, it seemed important that this story be shared with the world. "Third lesson," James continued, his confidence growing, as he saw the positive impact he was having, "is the most important one. Being a true guard means knowing when the rules matter and when people matter more." The crowd had gone quiet again, sensing that this was the heart of what they were witnessing. Today, I saw a little girl who had traveled very far and wasn't able to see the ceremony she had dreamed about. The rules said I should ignore her and maintain my position. But my heart said that serving the people means actually serving the people, especially those who need it most. Spontaneous applause broke out across the courtyard. It wasn't the polite applause of tourists who had seen a good show, but the deep, sustained applause of people who had witnessed something meaningful. Emma tugged on James's red uniform coat. When he knelt down to hear her whisper, she said, "Are you in trouble for helping me?" The question was quiet enough that only James heard it, but the concern in her voice was clear. James realized that this brave little girl, in the midst of her own joy, was worried about the consequences he might face for his kindness. "You know what?" James said, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Even if I am in trouble, it was worth it. Sometimes the best thing a person can do is get in trouble for doing what's right." The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. Cheers erupted from every direction, people were hugging strangers, and the atmosphere was electric, with collective joy and inspiration. But then something unexpected happened. James heard the distinctive sound of military boots marching in formation, and he turned to see his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, approaching with several other senior officers. The crowd noticed too, and a hush fell over the courtyard. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, wondering about. Would James face consequences for his unprecedented break from protocol? Would the magic of the moment be shattered by military discipline? Emma instinctively stepped closer to James, her small hand reaching for his much larger one. The gesture was protective and brave, as if this 7-year-old girl was prepared to defend the guard who had defended her dreams. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stopped directly in front of James and Emma. His expression was unreadable, his posture rigid with military bearing. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, to everyone's amazement, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison smiled. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard, "in 30 years of military service, I have never seen a more perfect demonstration of what it truly means to serve with honor." The collective sigh of relief from the crowd was audible. Emma's grip on James's hand relaxed and her smile returned in full force. "However," the lieutenant colonel continued, and the crowd tensed again, "I do believe there's something you've forgotten." James looked confused. "Sir," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison gestured toward Emma, "you've taught everyone about standing at attention, about saluting, and about serving with honor. But you haven't taught them the most important skill of all." "Which is, sir?" The lieutenant colonel's smile grew wider. "You haven't taught them how to march like a proper Queen's Guard." The implications of what he was suggesting hit James immediately, and his eyes widened with disbelief. "Sir, are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Sergeant. I'm giving you a direct order. I want you to teach every person in this courtyard how to march like a Queen's Guard, and then I want you to lead them in a proper formation around the palace courtyard." The crowd erupted in the loudest cheer yet. Emma jumped up and down with excitement. Margaret sobbed with joy, and even the other Queen's Guards broke their stoic expressions to smile at the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary scene in the history of Buckingham Palace. James, with the full support of his commanding officer, began organizing nearly 1,000 tourists, locals, and curious onlookers into something resembling a military formation. "Right then," James called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years training recruits. "We're going to do this properly. Everyone form lines of 10, with the smallest people in front and the tallest in back. The logistics of organizing such a massive group should have been chaos, but somehow the shared excitement and goodwill made it work. Parents helped children find their places, teenagers assisted elderly visitors, and strangers worked together with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Emma, naturally, was placed in the very front row, right next to James. She had been designated as his assistant instructor, a role she took with adorable seriousness. Margaret was helped to a position in the second row, despite her protests that she was too old for such nonsense. "I've never marched anywhere in my life," confessed a businessman from Tokyo, who found himself in the formation despite having planned to spend only 5 minutes watching the ceremony before heading to a meeting. Neither had any of us when we started, James assured him. The secret is to listen, watch, and remember that we're all in this together. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had taken a position where he could observe the entire proceedings, and James noticed that several other high-ranking military officials had quietly joined the crowd of observers. Word had clearly spread throughout the palace, and it seemed that everyone wanted to witness this unprecedented event. First, we learned to stand properly, James announced, demonstrating the correct posture once again. Shoulders back, chin up, eyes forward. Remember, you're representing the finest military tradition in the world. The sight of hundreds of people attempting to stand at military attention was both inspiring and amusing. A 5-year-old boy was so focused on standing straight that he was barely breathing. An elderly woman from Scotland was executing a nearly perfect stance despite using a walking cane. A group of teenagers who had initially seemed more interested in taking selfies were now completely absorbed in getting their posture exactly right. Emma, standing beside James, was glowing with pride as she helped demonstrate each position. Her earlier fatigue had completely vanished, replaced by an energy that seemed to radiate from her small frame and infect everyone around her. Now, James continued, we learn to march. The key is coordination. We move as one unit, like parts of a single machine. Left foot first and remember to swing your arms. He began with a simple demonstration, marching in place while counting cadence. Left, right, left, right. Feel the rhythm. This isn't just walking, it's moving with purpose and dignity. The first attempts were predictably chaotic. Some people started with their right foot, others forgot to swing their arms, and a few seemed to be marching to an entirely different rhythm. But gradually, slowly, something magical began to happen. The group began to synchronize, first in small pockets, then in entire sections, and finally across the massive formation. The sound of hundreds of feet hitting the cobblestone in unison created a rhythm that seemed to pulse with life and energy. Outstanding, James called out, his own excitement obvious. You're starting to look like real guards. Emma, marching beside him with determination that far exceeded her small size, called out, Are we doing good, Sergeant James? You're doing perfectly, Assistant Instructor Emma, James replied formally, which made her beam with pride. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stepped forward and addressed the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to do has never been done before in the history of this palace. You're about to march as honorary Queen's Guards around the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. I want you to remember this moment for the rest of your lives. The crowd's response was immediate and emotional. Many people were crying openly now, overwhelmed by the significance of what they were experiencing. This wasn't just a tourist attraction anymore. It had become a moment of genuine human connection and shared joy. Formation, attention, James commanded, and amazingly, the massive group snapped to attention with impressive coordination. Forward march. The procession began slowly, James, setting a pace that even the smallest children and eldest grandparents could maintain. Emma marched proudly beside him, her small legs working hard to keep up with his longer stride, but her determination absolute. As they moved around the courtyard, something extraordinary happened. The rigid formation began to feel natural, the synchronized marching became effortless, and the diverse group of strangers transformed into something that resembled an actual military unit. Margaret, marching in the second row, felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her granddaughter leading hundreds of people. In this incredible demonstration, the little girl who had been too weak to see over the crowd was now at the front of a formation that included people from dozens of countries, all united in this moment of pure joy. The media coverage was unprecedented. News crews from around the world were broadcasting live feeds of the extraordinary scene. Social media was exploding with videos, photos, and comments from people who couldn't believe what they were seeing. But for Emma, none of the external attention mattered. She was living her dream, marching beside a real Queen's Guard, leading a formation of hundreds of people who had all come together because one person had chosen kindness over protocol. How are you feeling, Emma? James asked quietly as they continued their march around the courtyard. Like I'm flying, she replied, her voice filled with wonder. Like I'm the most important person in the whole world. You are, James said simply. Today you absolutely are. As they completed their circuit of the courtyard, the formation naturally came to a halt back where they had started. The crowd of observers, which had grown to include palace staff, passing, pedestrians, and people who had rushed over from nearby areas, broke into thunderous applause. But James wasn't finished yet. He had one more surprise that would make this day truly unforgettable for Emma and everyone else who had participated in this extraordinary event. Formation about face, he commanded, and the group turned to face the crowd of observers. Ladies and gentlemen, James announced, his voice carrying across the now silent courtyard, I present to you the finest group of honorary Queen's Guards ever assembled, led by Assistant Instructor Emma Thompson, age 7, who has shown us all what it means to have courage, determination, and an unbreakable spirit. The applause that followed was unlike anything anyone present had ever heard. It wasn't just clapping. It was a celebration of humanity, of kindness, of the power of one person's choice to make a difference. As the applause finally died down, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stepped forward once again. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something important was about to happen. Assistant Instructor Thompson, he said formally, addressing Emma directly, would you please step forward? Emma looked uncertainly at James, who nodded encouragingly. With her grandmother's proud smile visible in the crowd behind her, Emma took several small steps toward the imposing lieutenant colonel. Miss Thompson, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of ceremony. In recognition of your exceptional courage, your inspiring leadership, and your demonstration of what it truly means to serve others, I hereby award you the honorary title of Queen's Guard for life. The crowd gasped collectively. Even James looked shocked. Such a title had never been created before, let alone awarded to a 7-year-old girl. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison reached into his uniform and produced a small, gleaming pin in the shape of the Queen's Guard insignia. This pin, he explained, to Emma and the crowd, means that wherever you go in the world, whatever challenges you face, you carry with you the honor and courage of the Queen's Guard. You have shown us all today that true service comes from the heart. As he pinned the insignia to Emma's yellow scarf, she stood as straight and proud as any soldier. The silence in the courtyard was profound, broken only by the sound of people crying tears of joy. Thank you, sir, Emma said in her small but clear voice. I promise to always remember what Sergeant James taught me about protecting hope. The crowd erupted once more, but this time the applause continued for several minutes. People were hugging strangers, sharing tissues, and many were openly weeping at the beauty of what they had witnessed. Margaret pushed through the crowd to reach her granddaughter, scooping Emma into her arms despite her own limited strength. I'm so proud of you, my darling, she whispered through her tears. But the day's surprises weren't over yet. James had been quietly coordinating with his fellow guards during the ceremony, and now they all stepped forward in perfect formation. Honorary Queen's Guard Thompson, James announced formally. Your fellow guards request the honor of your presence for the official photograph. What followed was a picture that would become iconic around the world. Emma stood in the center, surrounded by 6 towering Queen's Guards in their full regalia, all of them breaking protocol to smile broadly at the camera. The little girl looked tiny among the imposing figures, but her presence somehow made them all seem more human, more approachable, more real. As the official photographer snapped dozens of pictures, James knelt down beside Emma one more time. You know, he said quietly, when I woke up this morning, I thought today would be just like every other day. Stand guard, follow protocol, go home. I never imagined that I would meet someone who would change my entire understanding of what it means to serve. Emma looked up at him with those wise eyes that seemed too old for her young face. You changed my life too, Sergeant James. You made my dream come true, but you also showed me that I could help other people's dreams come true, too. The profound simplicity of her words hit James like a physical force. This little girl, facing medical challenges that would overwhelm most adults, had somehow grasped the essence of service and leadership better than many people twice her age. As the official ceremonies wound down and the crowd began to slowly disperse, something remarkable happened. People weren't leaving as strangers who had shared a tourist experience. They were leaving as friends, as people who had been part of something transformational together. Exchange of contact information was happening everywhere. The businessman from Tokyo was making plans to visit the Scottish grandmother who had marched beside him. The teenagers who had started the day interested only in selfies were helping an elderly gentleman find his way back to his hotel. The Australian woman who had comforted Margaret was already making plans to visit them in their hometown. Emma's story began spreading around the world within hours. The videos and photos from the day were shared millions of times across every social media platform. News outlets from dozens of countries picked up the story, but more importantly, it was being shared person to person, friend to friend, as people felt compelled to tell others about this moment of pure human goodness they had witnessed. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the people who had been there in person. Every single person who had participated in that unprecedented march would carry the memory with them forever. In a world that often seemed divided and harsh, they had experienced firsthand proof that kindness, courage, and human connection could still create magic. James returned to his duties that day with a completely different perspective on what those duties meant. He had faced no punishment for his break from protocol. Instead, he had been commended for demonstrating the true spirit of service that the Queen's Guard was meant to represent. More importantly, the incident had sparked a quiet revolution within the ranks. Other guards began looking for small ways to connect with the people they served. Nothing as dramatic as James's unprecedented action, but meaningful gestures that reminded everyone that behind the ceremonial uniforms were real people dedicated to service. Emma returned home with her grandmother, but she was not the same little girl who had left. The experience had given her something that no medical treatment could provide: an unshakable belief in her own worth and capability. Her doctors noticed the change immediately. Her energy levels improved, her appetite returned, and her overall response to treatment became markedly better. But Emma's impact extended far beyond her own recovery. Inspired by her experience, she began visiting other children in the hospital, sharing her story and her newly discovered understanding that everyone has the power to make someone else's day better. The pin that Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had given her became her most treasured possession, but she didn't keep its meaning to herself. She created a Hope Pin program at her local children's hospital, where recovering children could earn special pins for acts of kindness and courage. Margaret lived to see her granddaughter grow up healthy and strong, pursuing a career in social work, always wearing her Queen's Guard pin and always ready to help others achieve their dreams. Years later, when James was promoted to lieutenant colonel himself, he instituted a new tradition. Once a month, the Queen's Guard would hold a special ceremony for children facing serious challenges. It became known as the Emma Thompson Day, and children from around the world would come to experience their own moment of magic and recognition. The story became legend, passed down through generations as proof that one moment of choosing kindness over convention could create ripples that extend far beyond anything we could imagine. It reminded people that sometimes the most important thing we can do is see another person's need and choose to act, regardless of the rules, regardless of the consequences, simply because it's right. Emma Thompson, Honorary Queen's Guard for life, had taught the world that true courage isn't about standing perfectly still or following every rule exactly. True courage is about standing up for what matters most: hope, kindness, and the unbreakable human spirit that connects us all.